Okay.
Going with a half full crowd.
Yeah.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay, everyone, if I can ask those who are still enjoying their coffee and chatting in the back to come into the conference center. We're going to get started again now with a presentation from Louise Fox.
That panel was just too much. Everybody's still discussing, debating. It was very exciting. Definitely a lot of ideas on the table. Yeah. Okay, it looks like I have to use my glasses for this. Although I can't see you. If I use my glasses, I can see what's in front of me. So good morning, and I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Myra and her team for inviting me to do this paper. I want to say it's joint work with my colleague Carolina Romero from the World Bank. Carolina, you want to stand up? She's in the back hiding, but it's joint work with her. And this is kind of a new area for me. So I certainly welcome your comments. But I'm really glad I got into this area. It's been great fun. Okay, so what am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to try to talk to you in 15 minutes about what is empowerment, what does it have to do with economic development, what does development have to do with women's economic empowerment, how is economic empowerment currently being measured, and I want to talk about the concept of domains, and then I'm going to offer some conclusions and suggestions. And I think my argument, so as to not leave you in suspense, yesterday, Dean Carlin kind of separated economic outcomes that we really care about, like employment, from empowerment outcomes. And I'm not sure as economists we should think that way. I would argue that empowerment outcomes underlie most of microeconomic theory and also development theory. I'm not the first one on the latter point to say that, but and that therefore we should be integrating them in our models, and we should be measuring them, and we should try to understand how they contribute to our economic outcomes and how our interventions affect them. And that is, of course, a topic that the panel earlier today was discussing as well, how the interventions affect them. So that's in a nutshell. Now, you can leave now if you want, or you can stay and hear the argument. Okay, so what is empowerment? This was really fun. What is empowerment? So, I went to Wikipedia. After doing this paper, I made a donation to Wikipedia. It's amazing. I went to Wikipedia to see what is empowerment. And that was quite helpful because I realized almost every social science domain has some concept of empowerment, but they're a little bit different. So for almost everybody, the fundamental is about power and agency. And for a psychologist, it's part of adolescent development in a way, for a developmental psychologist, power and agency. So as you transition from a dependent child to an independent adult, developing power and agency is part of it. For a community psychologist or social psychologist or whatever, it's a characteristic of a community, and it's something a community can develop. And according to Wikipedia, that's where empowerment was first actually developed, was in that group. And political scientists also have notions of empowerment that are more similar to the community and group elements. For management, there's a management theory of empowerment, and it's kind of about delegation. But it is kind of about power and agency of workers and giving them resources and allowing them to make a job. Nalia Kabir, who's terrific, offered this. I don't know if you can read it. Can you read? Do I need to read it to you? You can read it? offered this short definition. There are longer ones that she's done in others, but she offered the short definition, which I thought was, pretty good. And then, just for interest, I put up the UN's definition of women's empowerment. Now, the difference between the two is kind of instructive because Nalia does not talk about rights and institutions, whereas the UN one incorporates the notion of rights and institutions. And that's a critical dimension between different notions of empowerment that I think are important. And I think the key elements in almost all definitions of empowerment that I want to stress is that they're both interior, what I call interior, or in the mind, and behavioral dimensions. So agency can start in the mind as an attitude. I can express it in behavior, but it starts in the mind as an attitude. So if I don't think I have the right to go to a bank, I won't exercise that behavior. If I don't think I have a right to go to school, I won't ask my parents, can I go to school? So it starts in the mind, and then it's exercised in behavior. That's sort of exercising the power. Almost all definitions have an idea of a process and outcome, and that can cause some confusion when people are measuring things. The process of community empowerment, the processes, as Nalia said, the processes through which women gain capacity for exercising strategic forms of agency, as well as an outcome. I am an empowered woman, or I am a sort of empowered woman, or I am a more empowered woman, or, whatever. And also, there's no question that the institutions of society enable or constrain empowerment. We were talking about norms. We've talked yesterday about laws. All institutions, all kinds of things in society which govern behavior. That's how economists use it. And all of those can constrain or enable empowerment. And I think those are the critical elements that we need to take away. Now, I argue in the paper that this idea of empowerment is actually pretty essential to both economists, microeconomic concepts in general, the framework of microeconomics, the toolkit that a microeconomist learns in school and applies to the problems at hand, and also to the problem of economic development. Now, in terms of microeconomics, I think what maybe is often missed is that microeconomics assumes agency. If a microeconomist says money is welfare, and if a microeconomist says with more money you can have a higher welfare, that assumes agency, right? Like, if you don't think that you can spend the money, or you can decide how to spend the money, or you feel extremely constrained about how to spend the money, decide how to spend the money, then you can't really achieve a higher welfare with money. Now, that's a kind of an old critique of microeconomics. It's going back to feminist economics and a lot of other radical economics and a lot of other places. That's not new to me. But it kind of got lost a while ago. And I think that's where behavioral economics actually comes in very strongly. So while microeconomics, including behavioral economics, is willing to assume that people are present biased, right? They may undersave because of present bias. They need to have some positive future expectations that there's something we're for and that they'll be able to act on. Right? So these are assumptions, foundations. So empowerment is crucial to microeconomics. It's also crucial to economic development. And this is something that Sen recognized, of course. And then I think it came back again with the work of Duflo and Banerjee, where they talked about poverty being disempowering and interfering with your not able to make longer term decisions and have the agency that microeconomics assumes. And that's why maybe some interventions to reduce poverty don't have the effect. I think psychologists originally thought about it as an individual concept. As I said, going back to adolescent development. But I think and that is kind of where economists and others went as well. But it's, of course, a community concept, and community values. The community can value empowerment or not. So it's not just the norms may restrict behavior of certain groups, especially women, but the community itself can value agency and empowerment or not. And the views of the community about agency change with the external environment. So that's an important concept too. And of course, we know exclusion is one of the main things that reduces empowerment. So economists talk a lot about exclusion and inclusive growth, and one of the reasons that's a problem is, of course, it reduces empowerment. Yet another a reason why we should care about inclusive growth is that that is yet another channel by which, and I think about the caste system in India as being the most extreme example, but you can also think about extreme inequality as having the effect of reducing empowerment and therefore reducing the prospects for economic growth and development. And that channel is important. Okay, so now from that background, I said, okay, cool. I'm now an economist and I'm into empowerment and it's all together for me. That's good, cool. What about women? What about gender? So then I looked at sort of the history of women's economic empowerment thinking. Now, so if you were standing up here 20 years ago, I mean, when people talked about women's economic empowerment, they basically meant girls' education and participation in the labor force. And that's how it was measured. That's how it was originally measured in the MDGs, if you remember the first MDGs, and that's how it was originally measured at the World Bank in their measurement, in their gender index, and that was kind of where it was. But there's been a lot of discussion since then, and now I think the most helpful definition is the one of Taylor and Perez-Neto. I apologize to Georgia Taylor. My software for citations insists on going alphabetical. It won't go the other way. The citation really is Taylor and Perez-Neto. But anyway, so I think we have the power within, and that's the interior notion that I've been talking about. We have the power to you act on that power within, right? We have the power over. That has to do with control, and that's also an acting on. And then we have the power with, the ability to organize with others, and there's the collective activity. Okay, so now OECD has kind of integrated that as well in their definition of empowerment, which you probably can't read because of the chairs, but it says that economic empowerment is the capacity of women and men to participate in, contribute to, and benefit from growth processes. So we have the inclusive growth again, in ways that recognize the value of their contributions, respect their dignity, and make it possible to negotiate a fair distribution of the benefits. So it's not kind of handed to them from God, it's negotiated. So these are, I think, this kind of notion of economic empowerment is, I would say it's sort of widely accepted in the economic empowerment literature these days. And so that's where I start. Now, the next question is women's economic empowerment necessary for development? And do development interventions foster empowerment? Well, okay, so some of the answer to that question was given by Dean Carlin yesterday, but the question is, did they measure empowerment? So if you think about those four components of Taylor and Perez-Neto, and then you think about how people usually measure empowerment, which is what Dean Carlin put up yesterday and what I'll put up today, they're usually checking on a very specific behavior pattern, which is participation in decisions about some household expenditures. Which, when you think about those four dimensions, so if you read one of these articles on does da-da-da intervention contribute to women's economic empowerment, they'll pay lip service to all these other concepts often in the introduction, but then you see the only thing that's being measured is participation in household economic decisions. And I would argue that that is not really enough. And others who've done these surveys have also argued that it's not really enough, and that it's Dean Carlin explains some of the ways in which those measures may not be done right in the first place, so that's why we may not get results. But in addition, it may not be the only dimension or the dimension that we really want to focus on. Now, others have focused on other dimensions. There are a few microfinance evaluations that have tried to use broader questions about agency in their evaluations, and there are also some evaluations on projects for adolescent girls that have tried to use broader ones. So there's been there are also one common thing is to use the views on gender norms. These have been kind of tested and used in the DHS surveys around the world. And so people will use, sort of, and the views on gender norms are things, or, when is it acceptable to beat your wife? That's the main gender norm that the DHS use. But it will also ask about your views about reproductive health and things like that. Some of them ask whether a woman should work. What are your views about whether a woman should work? Some of them this Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index is a very interesting project and a very interesting index. IFPRI's kind of the lead on that. Others are working on it. And they're looking at the time use and allocation of chores. And I have some questions about that, but okay. They're looking at, mobility. That's one that is more commonly used. Can you leave they asked the woman, can you leave the house? Some of studies, a very interesting one from the Pop Council, I thought, which was done on South Africa, actually used GPS systems to look at where female adolescent girls wandered and where adolescent boys traveled, and the difference between the geographical space in which they were allowed to travel, which was quite interesting. And you have the Women's Economic Empowerment Index is also, in Agriculture Index, is also using whether someone belongs to a group or speaks up to capture the power with. Now, one of my issues with that index and other index projects, I understand why people make indexes. I got the statistics of that and all of that and variables and power and all that kind of stuff. But, I don't know if I sometimes I get these indexes and I feel they're like really a mashup. And I'm not sure what's been mashed up. And I really think we need a lot more work on the components of the index and how they relate. And okay, that may mean bigger samples or whatever, but I think we have to ask that question. Okay, so now another element of this is development interventions, outcomes, and measure. Oh, I got to the right one. Okay, so another element of this is how you check whether an intervention increases economic empowerment and whether that's relevant to the outcomes. So if we think about theory of change, some people say, okay, I think economic empowerment is an intervening variable in my theory of change. Here's my final outcome: women's reproductive health, earnings, political participation, whatever. Here's my final outcome. And I think that empowerment is an intervening variable. And some people think, okay, I need to achieve this outcome here, and then empowerment will come. So if women just work, that will develop power and agency. If women just get access to education, that will develop power and agency. If we can just improve educational outcomes. So people think about it in different ways. And I think the evidence on the causality is pretty weak about which one it is to begin with. And whether I'm now doing a project on agricultural transformation and women's economic empowerment. And I think the funder kind of wants us to find that women's economic empowerment is essential for agricultural transformation. And we're not going to find that. It may be essential for inclusive agricultural transformation, but I don't. So Esther Duflo did a very good survey, and other people have surveyed since. And so I think that kind of macro causality is not established. And I'm really not sure we're going to establish it. But there are some interesting RCTs about empowerment as an intervening variable. I think about the Kenya cook stoves, where the ones that were given empowerment training sold more cook stoves than the ones that weren't. And there are a couple other RCTs of that type. That was kind of my question about bundled interventions. That's where I was going on the previous in the previous session about the question. And so a lot of people are a lot of people now are including life skills training to get that empowerment. But of course, the problem is if you're bundling the life skills training with all these things, you don't know actually whether that part of it made a difference. You can check to see whether you got that outcome and it made it, and whether getting that outcome made a difference. But it's a little bit complicated. So I would argue that we need to think about how we're going to research this question. So then, in thinking about how we're going to research this question, okay, am I going the wrong way? I already did this slide, right? Yeah, okay. I think it's important to think about types of empowerment and are they linked? Now, I found this typology of empowerment, which for those of you who can't read, is economic empowerment, political empowerment, social empowerment, and psychological empowerment. In a review by Brody of economic empowerment interventions. And I don't know if it came from those authors or whether it came from someone else. The authors didn't cite it. So if it came from someone else, if you first saw this 20 years ago, do let me know where you saw it. I'd like to cite the original source. But I thought it was kind of an interesting idea. So the idea is that you separate out economic power is the ability of women to access, own, and control resources. It doesn't talk about transactions, by the way, but access, own, and control resources. The second is political empowerment, ability to participate in decision-making focused on access to resources, rights, and entitlements, and it includes legal rights. Social empowerment, the ability to exert control over non-economic decision-making within the household. And psychological empowerment, the ability to make choices and act on them. My problem is I sort of didn't like putting psychological at the end, because remember, we have the interior definition and the behavior. So I wasn't really happy with that. But I also wondered, can you actually separate these? You know, maybe these are linked, but maybe we should separate them to find out if they're linked. So a modest proposal. You will not be able to read my modest proposal. But what we have here is we have, going down the side, the 4 types of empowerment: economic, social, political, and psychological. And then attitudes and behaviors. And my idea is we should now in our research start measuring attitudes and behaviors in these 4 domains. And we should not put everything in an index after we measure it. We should do some work on what are the intercorrelations, how they relate. And I gave examples here, which you can't read, of what's the difference between an attitude and a behavior in a different realm, just to give you some idea. We have, oh God, I'll never be able to read it on my slide. We have here, so an attitude is that you believe women, for economics, is you believe women can, oh, whoops, that wasn't good. You believe women can work outside the home, okay? And a behavior is you went and looked for a job, or you went to job training, right? And in, for example, the social zone might be your attitudes toward gender norms, mobility, whether you think you should be able to leave the house without permission, and your behavior is you do it. So we probably maybe need to see both the attitudes, behaviors, because, as Bruce Weidick, I was influenced by Bruce Weidick's paper on the economics of hope as well. As he said, dreams alone aren't good enough. You have to act on them, right? So if all our attitudes are about dreams and not the attitude that I can do it, it's maybe a good idea to check on behavior, but maybe we should find out whether people condone gender-based violence, not just whether they sought help if they got gender-based violence, and sought help about how to reduce it. And you could have a third column here, which are your non-empowerment outcomes that you think maybe these affect. Now, maybe your non-empowerment outcome is didn't experience gender-based violence. And you can see whether it's the attitude or the behavior that had an effect on it. Or maybe your non-empowerment outcome is you had a lot of earnings. And I better finish up, so I'm not going to give any more. But anyway, you get the idea. Okay, I'm running out of time. I ran out of time. So here are the conclusions. I think we should recognize attitudes and behaviors as key definitions of empowerment. We should try to measure both attitudes and behaviors. We shouldn't get stuck on behaviors and whether, especially not just one specific behavior, one specific negotiation that might happen in a household. We should experiment with scales. And people who don't like to experiment with scales and subjective scales, like our gold standard now in research is medicine, and they've been using pain as a subjective thing. And they've been using scales on pain for years in testing the effectiveness of treatments. So why can't we do it? Let's try. And then, of course, I'm suggesting to separate out the domains. I think we need survey research. Another time we can talk about the vignettes. I'm fascinated if we're starting to use vignettes to anchor some of these domains of the women's empowerment index that they're working on. And let's use experimental designs to see how the domains are linked. Thank you.
If it goes off, please 18.
So thank you, Louise, for, I think that was a good segue into the session. I'm Karen Groen, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to moderate the session, which is on how do we measure empowerment. And here in the session, we'll be talking both about objective ways of measurement, but also subjective dimensions of measurement. We have 4 panelists, which I will just quickly introduce. We have Kelly Holman, who's with the Pop Council and a longtime friend from many years ago, works on adolescent girls and is going to talk about some of her research. We have Susana Martinez Restrepo from Fede Desarrollo. No, I didn't get that, did I? In Colombia. Deb Rubin, who's with Cultural Practice and known to many of us for many years, and Martin Valdivia, who's with GRADE, a fantastic think tank in Peru, who's been thinking about these questions also for a really long time. I'm going to ask you all some questions. I'm going to ask you to speak for 2 minutes about the highlights, the takeaway messages of the paper that you wrote for this project, since I'm not sure everybody here has read the paper, so it would be great to have an introduction. And then I want to have a conversation with you about some of the measurement issues, touching perhaps on some of the issues that Louise mentioned, but things that have come out of your papers as well. So maybe I can start with you, Kelly, and just the 2-minute elevator speech.
Sure. So thank you very much to Myra and to all the organizers of this conference. It's been a great conversation so far. I submitted some slides, but I don't know if they're available or not. But otherwise, I'll do the 2-minute version. But basically, what we have focused on at the Population Council is there's a growing spread between what girls are responsible for and what they have control over starting at puberty. So at puberty, basically, it's a disinvestment point for girls. If you look at the slide that is up on the screen here, the red, this is DHS data from Tanzania showing that by year of age, girls are much more likely to drop out at the point of puberty. So you can see at age 13, 14, these are urban girls. The red is not in school, yellow is behind in school, green is in school. If you go to the next slide, for rural girls, it's even more extreme. The dropout again starts at age 12, 13, 14, around puberty. At this time, girls are expected to take on women's roles, but they're still legally, okay, thank you. Girls are, by gender and cultural norms, girls are expected to take on women's roles, yet they do not have the legal rights of adults, and so they cannot access services, et cetera, opportunities that women can access, when women can access them. There is growing spatial exclusion of girls. This is what Louise mentioned in her talk. This is a slide from South Africa. With age, boys' areas they can navigate in the community actually expand. For girls, it's just the opposite. You can see for girls age 11 and 12, it's the very same community. At 11 and 12, it's almost the same for the blue and yellow, but you can see for girls, their area that they can navigate in the community and actually access services, resources shrinks very, very drastically as they hit puberty. The next slide here, I won't go through every single piece of the slide, but basically when there are economic institutions and services available, job training, savings, microcredit, it's mainly for adult women. Girls are not allowed to access these services. The same, a related point to the sort of gender role issue is the growing dependency burden of girls. So as they get older, as they drop out of school starting at puberty, they start to have children, they start to get married. When they earn income, they start to actually take care of their extended family and other people's children, not just their own children, so dependency burdens grow. This is actually the chances that a woman will experience single motherhood in her lifetime in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the chances are pretty darn high. Most girls will be single mothers in their lives. They do not want to anticipate or expect this. They want to be hopeful and think they'll have a good man in their lives that will help them, but often that is not the case. So that's another piece of it. And then finally, girls do not have social networks. We ask girls to talk about important people in their lives. And they mentioned, this is in Tanzania again, they mentioned mother, father, different community leaders, but then across the board, important people in the community who are supposed to be carers, pastors, religious leaders, sheikhs, community elected officials, were actually people who sexually preyed on girls. And so they were not seen as protectors, they were seen as actually dangerous to girls. And finally, we ask girls, who do girls like you in this community have sex with? Not who you have sex with, who do girls like you have sex with? And in 3 different settings across Tanzania, we had 13 distinct types of sexual partners. 8 of those partners, 8 of the 13, were age-disparate partners who were basically for structural access, economic access, hope for jobs, accessing health care, transportation, taxi drivers, et cetera. So when there are no jobs for girls, even if they have access to education and training, basically they depend on sexual relationships, whether they're marriage or other types of sexual liaisons, to survive. So that's the 2-minute speech with some visuals. So thank you,
Kelly. Susanna, maybe you can give the 2-minute elevator pitch.
Okay, so I wrote a think piece with my co-author, Johanna Dancari from the Instituto Estudios Peruanos. It's a think tank in Peru, and this is part of a book we're writing with the support of the IDRC. And basically, what we are doing is, as local researchers, we are being critical of the instruments that we have been using traditionally to measure women's empowerment. We have been thinking about whether the measures that we are using to measure subjective well-being are working or not. In the field, we have seen that for our cases in Colombia and Peru, among extreme poor women and moderate poor women, they are not really working. So we are discussing this from our perspective as local researchers, and I want to highlight 2 points that we explain in the think piece. So one is decision making. We traditionally use decision-making instruments, as you know, who makes the decision in the household. Is it me? Is it me and my husband, or me and my partner, me with someone else, or me alone? And what we found is that, and we define if I make the decision, or if I make the decision with my husband, then, or my partner, then I will be empowered. And what we found is that women were super empowered after some programs. But when we went to see what happened in qualitative methods with focus groups and triada, something that we use small groups of 3 friends, they didn't really understand the questions, or they really didn't make the decisions. So we tried to understand what was going on, and we have some hypotheses on, well, first, they might not be understanding the question. Second, we might not be asking the right question. Third, they assume that if the husband told them, oh, I am going to buy this TV, that was making the decision with the husband. So we discuss these issues as some of the potential mistakes we are doing with using these measures, and how we need to use them more critically and test other ways of doing it. So that's the first. And the second one is the well-being stairs. I don't know if you're aware that in subjective dimensions, we keep using these stairs where there are 10 stairs, and we said, okay, from 1 to 10, how free are you to make your own decisions and making choices over your life? So 1 is no choice, no freedom over the decisions over your life, and 10 is the greatest. And then we realized that they weren't understanding. In Peru, for example, it took them on average 8 minutes to respond to questions, and servers are like, please respond, and at the end, we assumed that they were just responding whatever the interviewer wanted to say. And in Colombia, in the think piece, I tell a funny story where women were saying, oh, okay, 5 years ago, because the question is, where were you 5 years ago and where are you now? And they said, 5 years ago I was with my mother-in-law, and then today I live alone. So we wonder what does it mean, and we have a little debate with Mayra. What does it mean? Does it mean that they didn't understand the question? Does it mean that they are making concrete examples of something, of a very abstract idea for a woman that has maybe 2nd degree of primary school? Maybe it is a proxy of 5 years ago she wasn't good off because she was living with her mother-in-law, and now she's better off because she's living by herself with her husband. Or maybe she didn't understand the question. And some of the things that we discuss in this think piece is the difficulty that we find asking abstract ideas to people that have very low education, to women that have very education background, that live on a more day-to-day basis, and that need more concrete examples to measure those very subjective ideas. So in the think piece, we have some ideas of how to tackle these, but I think that we are just discovering what's going on and being critical where we are using, and we need to find a way, the conclusion is that we need to find a way to make questions more related to their day-to-day life, to their concrete life experience, to the life they have in that place, and not a very abstract concept that for someone with a PhD or a master's degree in the US is very easy to ask as agency and freedom of choosing. That is not very easy to understand. So I invite you to read the think piece.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go to Martine, who's going to speak about Chris Woodruff's paper, but you have also done so much work on this in your own research that you can do both. So just give us what Chris's piece says in the 1 minute, and then you can embellish.
Well, okay, so I knew you were going to surprise me. I mean, okay. I have to prepare quickly. So first I sympathize with Marcus that he didn't prepare a paper and he needs to come talk here. I feel the same. I mean, you know, it's complicated, but okay. It's also good to be out of the box, you know, not prepared, but trying to see what they were thinking, what their the ideas. So first, Chris topic, our main argument is around that the connection between, or the extra variable that refers to control of time. That the people needs empowerment has to do with the way they can control their time in doing things. And that is connected to some objective measures towards stress, that's our saliva and things like that, but also some specific questions about if they have feel depressed, if they have been able to sleep in the recent time, all questions related to, because that is connected to the fact that they are suffering in the way to controlling their time to get to do, women, to do everything that they need to do. And we know that women, it's more complicated in more traditional societies because of the multiple roles, and the multiple roles that, have some extra demands for women. So they have to be an income earner, they have to be a wife or, partner, and then mother and all that stuff, and then the male seems to be able to just focus on the income earner, and the other roles are, they don't seem to affect that much that component, and the women, they need to move within all of them, and that generates stress, and then that's one of the arguments that he's saying, and that's a very interesting argument that you will need to read the piece because he has much more than what I'm saying at this moment, but it's kind of the idea of grasping, and it's a point that maybe is less touched when we're talking about empowerment, and then so that's a good contribution that he's offering us. More generally, to the idea, I agree when listening to Luis that there's a brilliant summary, a presentation of the thing is that in general we know that we have just recently started to see more work on gender equality with hard data or with rigorous evidence of if it works, not, and everything, and that's very good. And we are improving in the way to do the objective measures of empowerment there, the economic empowerment there. Not yet that well, but we are improving, getting better. But we are even less good at, or very bad in the subjective empowerment component. And I totally agree with Luis in the sense that we need to understand that that's at the heart of the microeconomics or development economics process, really. And then you need to understand how like being an entrepreneur fits within the women's life goals and strategies of fulfilling their what is she trying to achieve through that process, and then observe that kind of thing. So given that we don't know yet much between the connection of these outcomes, these intermediate outcomes, that's something that was coming up to me, the discussion we had a few years ago with Myra about doing these intermediate and final outcomes, making us think of the difference between the two. And here maybe is that we are maybe looking too much at what we could call the final outcomes. And if we don't see the intermediate ones, we're not able to understand or to interpret what is going on with the so-called final outcomes of the process, like the stress thing in particular, for example, but also some others. Like, for example, some people, at some recent event, I was talking and they were saying, well, you now want them to be innovative and you want them to be care of a growing business, and that's going to add stress to her, and that's going to be bad for her. So if we don't understand how that fits within her goals, then we'll have the index in which one variable that goes one direction, the other variable goes in the other direction, because she has indeed more money to educate her children, for example, and that may be part of what she understands as very empowering, that the ability to provide something to their offspring is empowering in certain, or you can be empowering in certain environments and people. But then also, of course, she's more stressed, and so you take that out, and then the index may show no change when there has been some change. So then I think that's what Luis was saying also. I mean, if you don't do the carelessly the index, you may end up losing the capacity to capture those kind of things. So, and that has to do with the point that maybe is a fault in our studies in business development, in a sense, which is we have, because we have time constraints for surveying too, right? So we have not got that much into the detail into the family processes that goes with that. Employment, education of all the other members of the family, and we need that if we want to understand empowerment. So, because we want to see all the processes that are going on, and the experimental evidence that we are generating more and more often now is perfect, or is very good, because we have an external intervention that is changing the income level of some of these populations, not touching directly the empowerment component, the subjective empowerment component, and then we want to see what their decisions are about that, because that will imply what they mean by empowerment, what they think of their empowerment. When they have more money, what do you want to do? Or that the same idea of what are the constraints that they will face. Some people will face some constraints than others. So all that process makes me think that maybe we're not that ready to just generate the index, you know? But we have a lot to learn, and we may have a good environment to do that when we're discussing evidence like we have been seeing in this conference.
Thanks, Martin. And actually, now we're going to hear a little bit about an index, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which I think Deb is going to talk a little bit about. And there's lots of issues to pick up on, but give us the 2-minute pitch, and then we'll go into some of the issues.
Sure. Well, actually, I wanted to start with just a couple of words about myself and the fact that I wrote this paper with Agnes Kisumbing at IFPRI, as well as a former IFPRI research assistant, Katie Spruill. So I'm up here representing 3 people. But I learned yesterday that I was actually a very special person, that I'm part of the 1%. I always thought I was part of the 99. But it turns out that women-owned businesses who actually employ other employees are among 1% of businesses globally. In the U.S., it's a little higher. But I am actually a woman-owned entrepreneur. So it was fascinating to me to do the assignment that we were given, which was to look at data sources about measuring these subjective components of women's economic empowerment, and to think about what it would be like if I was asked some of those questions. And let me assure you that depending on the day, I would either be very empowered or I would be totally disempowered. So I think it helps me provide some context to some of the data sources that we looked at. Certainly the things that we found, and I'm not speaking only about the WEA here, but we found that, as Louise mentioned, there really are very few globally representative measures of women's subjective measures of women's empowerment. And we were asked particularly to look at rural women entrepreneurs, and that's an even smaller subset. So it's an area where there's definitely a lot of work to be done. What we found were many areas where there were gaps rather than a lot of areas where there was already good work. And some of the gaps that speak specifically to the elements of empowerment that Louise mentioned, which are the individual as well as the institutional and the community, are not a gap being not taking into consideration, for example, the environment within the home, or information about whether or not the spouse or other partners are supportive of the woman's entrepreneurial efforts or economic efforts, wage labor, and so on. Another area that was missing was looking at, again, some of the people have already spoken about that, the relationships between some of these characteristics. So there are a lot of pieces of information that we need to get better information on. We've obviously done a great job in improving the amount of data that we have, but on these particular areas, we still need a lot of work. So on the WEA in particular, It is one of the measures that looks at women's economic activities in rural areas, specifically in agriculture, Women's Empowerment Index in Agriculture. And it was formulated by both IFPRI and the Oxford Poverty and Health Institute, so it's a joint effort funded by...
No, it was help created by USAID.
Help created by USAID. I stand corrected. I think the vocabulary now is co-created, right? Okay. So co-created by USAID and certainly funded also by USAID. You know, the intention, it was formulated as a population-based survey, and the intention was really to provide a snapshot of the situation at a particular time within a country, within the zone of influence at AID, and to be able to see whether the needle moved from one iteration of the index to another iteration of the index. And I think it's really important to point out, to broaden the presentation that Louise gave, is that there actually are underlying mathematical equations about how the different parts of the index can be decomposed so that you can understand how each factor influences the outcome. I am not the person to talk about that because, actually, Karen, you probably are much better positioned to do that because I come to this as a qualitative person. I'm 1% again in that area. But it's certainly a rigorous formulation that does allow for a taking apart of some of these elements. I'll stop there.
Great. I think we have so much food for thought. There's a few things that I want to actually pick up and then ask some questions about for different of our panelists here. I want to start, I think, with something that Kelly said that I think is really important, and other panelists have referred to it, but in somewhat different ways. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to it. So, of course, everybody talks about a core component being control and decision-making. And we've heard a critique of that, and I certainly support Susanna's critique, particularly when it comes to the way that the DHS and others operationalize it about household decision-making, which one can argue is more about a norm, for instance, a social norm about what people are expected to do, as opposed to something that's really a meaningful decision, even when you move to large household purchases. And I think we have to, and the more I've worked on this field, I think we have to understand what decision-making, what it means. But what Kelly said, and so I'm going to come to you, Susanna, to talk about that in a minute. But Kelly said we forget what people are also responsible for. And I think that is so important in terms of the context and measuring that. The fact that it is, and we talk about norms, but I don't think we've satisfactorily understood and figured out how to measure how people internalize a norm and what's a real preference or a real action in absence of a norm versus the norm itself. And it's not just the norm, it's actually the fact that if you do something sometimes because you're coerced to do it. So the threat of violence, if you don't get the dinner to the table on time, is something that's really important. And how do we bring these issues into this area? So it's not just Louise's attitude and behavior. This piece is absolutely critical to get into this. So Kelly, can you say a little bit more about how you think we should address that? It's tough.
Sure. I'm glad you brought this out because this came up yesterday in some of the conversations around sharing, and I think Myra mentioned it and some other presenters mentioned it, is basically, it sounds so stereotypical, but women are conditioned to be carers, right? And like it was just discussed by Elizabeth and others that in the CCT realm, basically the money was always given to the mother because, the notion is that she's
Good
going
mother
to
hypothesis.
share like more widely than the father would. And these sort of pressures and norms actually become internalized by girls early on. And when it comes to caretaking of siblings, when it comes to helping with household chores, whether it's in a sort of day-to-day environment, or even when push comes to shove in humanitarian and emergency situations as well, it's often the girls who are the ones who are willing to, get married early to relieve their families of an economic burden. The girls are the ones who go out and basically, bring the dinner home, regardless of whether it's an, unsavory way of, having to do that. And so I really think this really starts to erode women's control over the resources that they do start to have, later in life, whether it's from earning income or money from, parents, friends, whatever it is, because there are so many pressures to take care of other people. And if girls, especially those who are under legal age, who cannot open a protected individual savings account, then they're even more subject to, sharing and having other people use their resources. We actually did an experiment where girls were introduced to savings accounts and met frequently in their sort of girls' collectives. And girls who had only the savings account without the sort of girls' meeting and collective on top of it, they were actually more subject to being sexually harassed and being approached to get their money because people knew they had savings accounts, than the girls who had the more sort of social supportive network around them to learn how to negotiate having money and how to protect their money. So this starts to happen, I think, earlier than we realize.
So there's two elements that you just brought out that I think are really important to flag. One is the element which I think is important for the decision making, is the issue of motivation. Sabina Al-Khair has a way of operationalizing this in the Women's Empowerment in Ag Index, which is, I make this decision because I think it's the right thing to do, or I make this decision because it's what others expect of me, or there's different ways to operationalize that. And I think doing more research on that is really important, on the motivation issue, to get at really to unpack this issue of decision making. But the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is under addressed in this literature, is the issue of the individual versus the social, the collectivity. And I think, well, I was surprised, Louise, you didn't really get into this. There's the individual domain of empowerment, but there's so much feminist literature that suggests the collective is what is so critical in terms of groups of women. Or, we heard it in funny ways this morning, the pairing of a woman with a buddy, for instance. And I think the collective is really important, and it's a frame that we have to really think harder about in terms of the measurement issues. There's another element of the collective that comes up here too, and I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to comment on this. At this conference that both Susanna and I were at in Göttingen, Germany, a few weekends ago, we heard this again from Sonal Desai, who's a wonderful researcher, sociology, at University of Maryland. And she really distrusts measures of empowerment, individual measures of empowerment. From a South Asian perspective, she thinks that people have collective ways of expressing themselves. They're part of a kinship. They're part of a caste. They're part of a unit. And so the individual is really just not the right approach. And so I'd like to maybe ask Susanna to comment on that, because you've been critical about some of the domains and ways we think about this.
Yeah, for example, something that happened to us in the field, and I don't remember if we mentioned it in the think piece because it was so short, is that we were wondering how labor decisions were made among extremely poor women. So we realized that they said that they would be making the decisions to work, but in reality, in the qualitative work, we realized that many women would say, I cannot go to work because I have to ask for permission to my husband, and maybe I cannot go out, and maybe he doesn't let me work. So we did a behavioral experiment about that, and we found significant effects to whether the experiment was, the treatment group was having the husbands present in the negotiation, and we offer a job, and then not having the husband present, and there were some constraints like child care, the cost of transportation, and we found an effect, so that means that that matters. But very interestingly, I was presenting this in Germany in the Feminist Economics Conference last year, and I saw this presentation by Nadisha from Bangladesh. I don't remember her last name. And she was showing her results on how the same labor decisions that were like, oh, this is not an so first step, this is not an individual issue. This is something that they have to negotiate with their partner. So we have to take into account that when we measure. But second step, she was saying that in Bangladesh, they have to negotiate with their partner or husband and then with their in-laws. So that was so interesting because we are forgetting the whole family context and also the differences among cultures and among socioeconomic status. So for example, me as a Colombian from a highly educated background, I tend to be more individualistic and make the decisions on an individual manner. But then I cannot go and impose my individualistic values from my PhD in the US to those women that I am interviewing because they have values that are more into the family, maybe a nuclear family in the case of Colombia. But then I cannot go to Bangladesh, and I have to take into account the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, the husband, and sometimes the siblings of the husband. So the negotiation gets very complicated, and I think that we need to account for that. And that is why, for example, we were talking in Germany why DHS is so complicated. It allows us to compare across countries, but it might not be relevant across all countries because these realities among the collectivity and the individual and what we need to take into account is completely different. And a very interesting proposal that came up, not to destroy the DHS because it's great, is to have some general measures and then some specific measures to each country or to each culture so that we can compare, but we can also know what's going on locally.
So Martin, maybe you, sorry, okay, Deb, I know you want to comment on this, then we'll go down the line. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that both the early WEA work as well as the work of IFPRI on its Gender, Agricultural, and Assets project has demonstrated exactly what you're talking about in trying to parse out the definitions of empowerment in the early WEA work. It was found that the women in Uganda were considering empowerment only when they themselves as individuals were able to control assets, whereas in Bangladesh, it was precisely what you were talking about, Susanna. It was that women within the context of the household who were able to gain assets and more access to resources felt more empowered. So the collective was important in the one Asian case, and the collective was less important in the sense of how it supported the individual, but certainly important in the sense that it was those norms that said that an individual is empowered if the individual can control the assets. And I think that that's something that now in the second round of the IFPRI's development of the project level WEA, they're really trying to tease out to a much greater degree.
How are they doing it?
They have added a series of modules, I think along the lines that you were just mentioning, about trying to have a set of core modules and then other modules that will be dealing with questions of autonomy, dealing about questions on self-efficacy, self-confidence, and some of those more subjective measures.
Martin, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, well, I totally agree that some of the problems for generating a global index will have to do with the idea that the definition of empowerment cannot be set only at the individual level, but you go to the family, the extended family, the kinship, the country, I guess. I mean, everything plays a role, and it's going to be difficult to go through. And that's part of what I had in mind when I was saying maybe we're not that ready to generate an index in the process. But for the discussion for this meeting, once I was invited, I came back to look at my data, this study that I published in JDE, and then we got some training intervention and that was generating some income shock increase profitability of their businesses. And the point I was saying in the previous presentation, the point is to see what do the people do with that, and what does that tell us about their concepts of empowerment, right? And then when I looked at it, and I looked at that survey, we had the time use questions in the process, no? And then it was very clear, and that has to do also with the dynamics, because we had two measurements, one a year after intervention and another one a second year. And so the interesting thing was happening with those kids that were transitioning from school towards university or something like that, okay? So those were the ones that immediately after the business was generating profitability, investment in their education was generated. I mean, in terms of time, probably they were going to fall into their dedication to education because, go to university is more expensive, it's a completely different story, but these guys were able to go into that process. And then you go 2 years later, and then you see that they are also more employed in independent jobs. So then now you have to think about why is it that if she was a business person that was a self-employed, but when she's trying to improve the situation of their kids, she's going through the position of the dependent job, probably with Social Security and all that stuff. Because in part, I interpret possibly what that point is, their definition of empowerment is through her kids. And then that's what she's doing. And then probably she also has more stress as a result of that. But in the process, she's probably moving in the right direction, maybe. But that's what we need to learn about that.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor, but I want to just have you think about one question that I want you all to come back to, which is this issue of this time dimension, right? And I'm interested in, it's connected to the issue of empowerment as a process. And does the subjective get us to the process closer than, get us closer to the issue of it being a process as opposed to some of these other objective domains? Anybody want to take a first stab at that? Kelly.
Maybe I can just not fully address the question, but just mention a piece of research. We did an experiment in South Africa where one group of young people, boys and girls, were given different kinds of life skills plus stress reduction, and then another where they were given the same life skills, but instead of stress reduction, they were given financial education. And the stress reduction group actually was able to save more than the financial education group. And we think, it's because in people's lives who are surrounded by poverty, HIV, no parents, food insecurity, lots of different things, stresses make you not have great decision making, right? And so a way to deal with some of the stresses that Martin is talking about, those kind of skills could potentially be important. So that's kind of some of the process stuff that I think is we really need to get a better handle on.
Martin, I know you want to comment, and then Susanna, and then I'm going to open it up.
Yeah. So, well, just to mention something that is the way we're approaching the issue at the current study. That you had a role in that way too, and people, and then we actually were coerced towards doing better at trying to measure this thing. Well, some people I'm looking at in particular. No, the point is, one of the things that I was reviewing in my data that we start to see in the process is that we have questions that may feel as inputs of some other outcomes. So if stress is an issue in the process, so if you in the business training provide some issues to deal with that, you may be more empowering than others' interventions. So in our study here, we were working about the idea of providing a support network, right? And that's one issue that has to do with a person being able to form a network, rely on the network, use it as a support, use it as a pressure to move on, to progress, and things like that. And being able to have that empowers you to achieve whatever you want to do. in the process. The other thing I was thinking that has to do with soft skills for entrepreneurs has to do with the idea of delegation. I think, Luis, you mentioned that, right? Very important. If you are talking about very small businesses, many of them, my hypothesis or my prejudice at this moment is they did it on their own, by themselves, doing everything, taking care of every single detail of their businesses. And now it's going to grow. And if they don't learn how to delegate the process, then the situation is going to be extremely stressful and probably fail in the process of trying to grow because, you know, she cannot handle everything. If she handles everything at 100, she cannot handle everything when she wants to do 1,000, something like that. So those soft skills from entrepreneurs are something that we need to consider a lot in terms of the future studies of what we want to do to empower women.
I think it's so interesting, Martin, because maybe there's a different interpretation of this not necessarily being soft skills, but it goes to this decision-making issue. A decision to delegate and not do it all yourself is a really interesting thing that might matter clearly in an economic domain. It might matter in the household
But
as
you
well.
also need the resources.
But you need the
to be able
resources
to
to
delegate.
delegate.
Right. It means hiring staff or hiring
Bring other
services
things,
and so
exactly.
on, which creates the stress. But if I could just add one point, I think, I'm not sure I understand exactly where you're going with the question, but if part of it is about trying to understand how much time a woman is spending in particular types of activities as opposed to others, and if we can understand in part of the definition of empowerment as reducing time spent in certain kinds of activities and increasing time spent in other activities, whether it's leisure or something else. I think especially in thinking about entrepreneurship, one of the components is the quality of time that you spend. So if you're really enjoying what you're doing, and so many women who are running their own businesses do say that they do it in part because they enjoy that sense of autonomy and independence and so on, then we would have to have two measures. One which would be about the actual number of hours, and the other which would be something like, you know, how satisfied are you with the time that you're spending on this? And that also speaks to something that came up in the earlier session about both the importance of context, and then Marcus mentioned something about doing qual and quant work. And I think that there's that role for mixed methods to be able to get at some of those questions.
Susanna, last word, and then we're going to take 2 questions from the audience.
Yes, so for example, some of the studies that I have done in Colombia show that, for example, on average in Colombia, in rural areas, a woman spends 10 hours doing household duties and taking care of children and the elder, and then 2 hours on average. So there's a huge problem there, and they have limited opportunity because of that. But I agree with what you said, and we were kind of becoming philosophers yesterday with Martin talking about that, because we have to take into account choice. So do I have the choice to use that time that way, or I don't have the choice? So for example, right now I open a foundation to empower women, and I have 2 jobs, and I'm working 18 hours per day, but I'm so happy. I am time poor, but this is my choice. I hope that it is not forever, but it is my choice. So in that sense, that lack of time makes me empowered because I'm doing something for it. Or for example, the example of Peru, and maybe not the case of someone that is opening a foundation, but maybe you choose to have 2 jobs because you want your children to go to college, and for you that is empowering. Maybe you're gonna see the returns when they have a formal job and they help you with your pension because you had an informal job and you never paid towards pension. So I think that it will be very interesting to think a way to measure time use and choice or something related that allows us to see that interaction. And I think that this is also coming back to decision making is associated with that, because something that is happening, we believe that at least for the case of Latin America, that making a lot of decisions makes us empowered. But in Latin America, we have this saying of the supermothers. So you work and you study and you take care of children and you take care of the elder and you do the household chores, and like, what time do you sleep? Is that empowerment? Really? So we must think also how we divided the time, and whether empowerment is that maybe we do less because we cannot do it all, and that the partners and the children and the sons start getting involved in those decisions and helping out more. Not, I shouldn't use actually the word help. Being involved in everything that is going on in the household. So maybe decision making and the interaction of time use have to change because we can be more empowered and do more things if we have less responsibility and try to be less of the super mothers.
Really important. Okay, a few questions. So the woman in the back. Oh my gosh, we have such a broad number of questions, but the woman in the back first. Can you state your name, please?
Hi. Okay. My name is Josie Lair. I am a senior gender advisor in the USAID Office of HIV/AIDS. So here, I'd like to ask a question about the topic of gender-based violence. So for example, there is a really interesting project happening right now in Zambia where there are many one-stop centers for GBV. Survivors come, they receive sort of the standard suite of services of medical, legal, and psychosocial, and this project has added innovatively the element of referring survivors to economic empowerment programs, with the understanding that a great reason for women not leaving violent partnerships is because of economic dependence on the partner. And so the question at hand is, how can we help this work grow? How can we help it be all the more effective? And so I'm wondering what kind of research is out there on, for example, what level of economic empowerment must a person have, subjective or objective? What is the threshold? Is there a key tipping point beyond of independence beyond which they're more likely to leave a violent partner? If we assume that the program is going to have the subjective empowerment component, let's help people, embrace the notion that violence is unacceptable, for example. Just on the economic level, are there particular initiatives, types of economic empowerment programs that might be most effective for GBV survivors? And what kinds of questions should we be asking to look at their effectiveness?
Thanks. This woman right here in the, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sheila Scott with IREX's Center for Applied Learning and Impact. My question is about technology and women's economic empowerment. So clearly technologies like washing machine, microwaves, right, have done a lot in terms of time saving for the wealthy, particularly in the global north. But what about ICT, information and communication technologies? I haven't heard very much talk about that. Technology itself is neutral. It can amplify opportunities as well as inequalities. But it also, in the case of ICTs and some research we're doing on the gender-digital divide, can be a massive time waste. And we're seeing this in particular when we're looking at gender differences in women's opportunities and constraints. And I'm wondering if you are looking at this in your research, including it in indicators, for example, in terms of attitudes and behavioral change, and any research you may recommend that the rest of us look at when we're designing our programs. Thank you.
Deb, would you like to take the question on violence?
On violence. So I thought you were going to let me do technology.
Well, okay, unless somebody else. Kelly, do you want to do that? One of you,
Well,
or either one?
Something about technology.
Do you want to speak about violence? I can say something, but if you would like to take that.
I guess I would just say that this is a question that's been with us for a long time. Myra was one of the people working on this many years ago. I don't know that there is a clear, definitive answer that we have, and I think a lot of it depends on the age of the individual, the context as well, and also remembering that it's not just economic factors that keep women in relationships, it's other things as well. So there is literature out there that we can refer you to, but I don't know that we have a sort of cut and dry, one-size-fits-all answer.
Just one other piece. If you don't know, the George Washington Global Women's Institute has some phenomenal resources that some are meta-evaluations of a lot of the research literature on the relationship between gender-based violence and economic interventions. So go onto their website and you'll find a lot there. ICT?
Okay, so 3 things. I can think about 3 things. One is a project that is being developed in Colombia by Ana María Ibáñez from Universidad de los Andes, which is actually randomizing washing machines to women so that the time use changes. That's really interesting. I don't know still the result, but the hypothesis is that, for example, these 10 hours that I'm talking about, when we disaggregate, like 5 hours are washing clothing. So by randomizing washing machines and what happens to that, that can improve the time use. Actually, in some poor neighborhoods in Bogota, I saw a very interesting practice, which is they buy very small washing machines that can be portable, and they rent them for like $1 an hour. So you can take the washing machine to your house, stay there 1 hour, wash your stuff, and go. So that can improve time management. I don't know the results, but Ana María Ibáñez from Universidad de los Andes, you can look for her to see if there's something published. Another thing that is very interesting, and also we have several examples worldwide and in Colombia, is banking through cell phones. And yesterday we had a panel about that. So that's allowing a lot of rural women to access banking financial services in rural areas. So I think that that's something technology is allowing to close that financial gap. And something really interesting that I am doing also with the IDRC on another project, and I think is quite new what we're thinking, is we're trying to understand in education what is going on with the use of technologies in education and how girls and boys relate differently with technologies and how that is associated to the gaps we see in math. And this could explain, this is a little research question, but this could explain eventually why there are so many, why there's such a huge gap in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math between boys and girls. So we are looking at methodologies on how to measure these, and what we're trying to see is whether when you use technologies, what happens with girls and with boys, what happens with teachers, whether teachers are paying more attention to girls or to boys, whether they're helping more girls or boys. And we are planning a little experiment with a platform called Brightspace, so that we can kind of do a little spy with analytics within the computers to see how girls and boys are acting differently with the technology and have some outcomes. So this is a little bit new and we're still discovering, but it's a way that first question is how we interact differently with technology in math, for example, and language, and whether that is associated with our career choice. And second, to see what's really going on what we are doing with technology. So we are starting to see that, and I think that there's a huge opportunity with big data and analytics, but we are still understanding how big data and analytics is working. So I think that that's going to be something for the next 20 years to discover.
I'll just add a very quick comment. I would challenge the notion that the technology is neutral. And what we're seeing in particularly in the area of sanitation, as well as in agriculture, that the design of the technology itself is very important in whether there's uptake by men or by women. So the Gates Foundation is doing a lot of work on sanitation, the right kind of toilet that will speak to both men's and women's needs. And USAID is funding a project, it's called Ingenious. We're working on part of that, looking at technology and agricultural extension and doing a technology assessment for different types of technology.
Well, just a little comment about what is in there in the research for that. I mean, the issue of domestic violence, for me, brings the point of social norms at play, and so you don't think only about the individual, but a collective effort to try to empower women in that process. So doing that is very complicated. We're trying to innovate a lot into that. Behavioral economics is maybe one area in which can help in the process. Some people started to try, for example, when there is these culturally charged behaviors, then to use things like soap operas, which are powerful for women. So there's some study a co-author of mine did in which he was showing that how providing the right role model of a person that is relatively close to, in image to the people may have some ability to change the expectation of the person about the women about that, and also the social norm moving in that direction. So things like that, I mean, this is a very challenging issue, and then we are trying to go different ways, trying to see if there is something we can do.
Just one comment about that. I think that
I don't know. Can we go on? I think we're probably at
Can I
time.
make just a little comment about technology? I just to close these, I think that because technology is so huge, we need to define what exactly. Because, for example, I can say, using analytics for evaluating programs in the future and for understanding what's going on can be neutral, but then the researcher that is doing the research might not be neutral. We have had already evidence showing that there are some algorithms that are racist. So those that develop the algorithms have biases, and they put the biases. So, and then there's washer machine that has nothing to do with big data analytics. So I think that we need to be also more specific when talking about technology.
Thank you so much. Let's give the panel a hand.
Wonderful this panel was that we've gone another 15 minutes. I just want, on behalf of CGD and Data2X and the UN Foundation and IDRC, thank everybody for attending and thanking the panelists. I have been incredibly privileged to have worked with so wonderful people. I mean, the people who wrote the papers, they're really amazing. They were very much engaged, involved, responsive. The papers, hopefully all of them are going to be out there, and they're all on the website. And thank you so much also for our two commentators. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to Data2X and to Emily for providing the funding. Thanks to the ExxonMobil Foundation. And good day to all of you.